The classification report was 14 pages long. The standard length for a preliminary Class 4 classification report was 6 pages. The standard framework produced a 6-page document when completed by a competent analyst working from adequate field data, and Drev was aware that 14 pages represented a deviation from the standard length that the review board would notice, and that he was not certain he could defend with specific evidence rather than general unease. He had written it anyway. He had written the standard 6 pages and then continued, because there were things he wanted in the record that the standard 6 pages did not have room for, observations and context, and the specific texture of the field data that the summary framework compressed into categories, and that he did not want compressed on this particular file. He did not know why he did not want it compressed. He knew that he did not. Senior cartographer Drev had written it himself, which was unusual in 2 ways. Unusual because the length exceeded the standard. Unusual because senior officers did not typically write classification reports at all. Classification reports for newly contacted species were typically compiled by junior analysts from field data submitted by the contact team, assembled into the standard framework, reviewed by a senior officer, and filed. The process existed because the standard framework existed, and the standard framework existed because the Vorath Cartographic and Contact Authority had been classifying species for 112 years, and had developed, over that time, a comprehensive methodology for doing it efficiently and consistently. Drev respected the methodology. He had used it for 22 years. He had produced, in those 22 years, classifications that were accurate and well documented, and that the review board had approved without significant revision in all but 3 instances. He was not a person who deviated from the methodology without a reason. He was a person who, on this occasion, had a reason he could not fully articulate, and had written 14 pages instead of 6 as the closest available substitute for the articulation he did not have. Drev had written this one himself because the field data had been submitted by a junior analyst named Orev who had been on his first independent contact assignment, and who had, in Drev's assessment, done the work carefully and completely, and had still managed to produce a classification recommendation that Drev found insufficient in ways he was not certain he could fully articulate yet. He had sat with Orev's recommendation for 2 days before deciding to write the report himself. This was not a criticism of Orev. Orev had applied the framework correctly. The framework was sound. The field data was accurate. The classification the framework produced when applied to that field data was Class 4, and Class 4 was the correct output of a correct process applied to accurate data. The problem, if there was a problem, was somewhere between the data and the unease, in a space that the standard framework did not have a measurement for. Drev had been in contact work for 22 years, and he had developed, over those 22 years, the specific kind of professional instinct that came from pattern recognition, across a large enough sample, that the pattern recognition sometimes outpaced the ability to articulate it. He did not trust instinct over evidence. He trusted it enough to write a supplementary note. The recommendation was Class 4, developing civilization, pre-interstellar, limited technological base, no space capability, no evidence of advanced energy production, no evidence of communication systems capable of reaching beyond their own atmosphere. Class 4 was the classification the framework produced when you applied the framework's criteria to the field data Orev had submitted, and the framework's criteria were the result of 112 years of refinement by people considerably more experienced than Drev. He had filed Class 4. He had also added a supplementary note to the file that was not part of the standard framework, flagged for the attention of the Contact Authority's Senior Review Board, which read, "I have concerns about the completeness of this assessment. The contact team's surface observation window was limited. I recommend extended observation before classification is confirmed. I am not in a position to articulate the specific basis for this recommendation beyond a general unease with the speed of the process. I recognize this is an insufficient basis for a formal review request. I am filing it as a note of record. The Senior Review Board read the supplementary note and noted it in the file and did not convene a review, which was the appropriate response to a note that acknowledged it had no specific basis. Drev filed the report and moved on to the next assessment in his queue and thought about T. He note periodically for the next 6 weeks. On the 48th hour after the classification report was finalized and transmitted to the contact authority's public registry, the registry updated. The update did not come from the contact authority. It came from the planet. The first transmission arrived at the contact authority's monitoring array at 3:40, routed through the standard frequency scan that the authority ran continuously on all recently cataloged systems as part of the post-classification observation protocol. The transmission was coherent, directional, aimed at the array's specific frequency, with a precision that the array's own technical staff described, in their initial assessment, as remarkable for a civilization that had been classified 48 hours earlier as having no communication systems capable of reaching beyond its own atmosphere. The technical staff's initial assessment was 2 sentences and contained one word that did not appear in the standard assessment vocabulary. The word was remarkable. Drev was the senior officer on the overnight rotation when the transmission arrived. He read the technical staff assessment. He read the word remarkable. Remarkable was not a word that appeared in the standard assessment vocabulary, because the standard assessment vocabulary had been designed to be precise rather than evaluative, and remarkable was an evaluation rather than a description. The fact that the technical staff had used it told him that the transmission had produced, in people trained to be descriptive rather than evaluative, a response that had exceeded the capacity of descriptive language to fully contain. He noted this. It was the kind of detail that the standard process did not have a field for, and that he filed in the part of his professional attention that tracked things without yet knowing where they would land. He sat forward in his chair. He asked the technical team to run the transmission through the standard decoding protocol. The standard decoding protocol was designed to process first contact transmissions from civilizations in the Class 3 to Class 5 range, which covered the range from early interstellar to developing pre-interstellar. It was a robust protocol. It had been developed over 90 years of contact work and refined after every significant first contact event. It was the best tool the authority had for this specific problem. It returned a partial decode in 11 minutes. Partial was a technical term. In this context, partial meant that the transmission contained structured information that the protocol could identify as structured, without being able to fully interpret the structure, because the encoding system the transmission used was not a system the protocol had encountered before, and was not a variant of any system in the protocol's reference library. The protocol's reference library contained 417 known encoding systems from 63 species across 2 centuries of contact work. The transmission used none of them. The technical team lead, a woman named analyst Sira, came to Drev's station at 4:03 with the partial decode report and a second document she had prepared on her own initiative that was not a standard report format. It was a working document, informal, with the kind of notations that people made when they were thinking out loud in writing. She put both documents on his console and told him, "The partial decode identifies the transmission as a response." He looked at her with the focused attention of someone who needed the next sentence before he could process the one he had just heard. A response to what? She told him, a response to the contact team's survey pass. The transmission references, as far as the partial decode can establish, the specific orbital path of the survey vessel and the timing of the surface observation window. The encoding is novel, but the structure contains elements that the protocol identifies as referential. It is referring to something. The most consistent interpretation of what it is referring to is the survey. She paused, then continued with the quality of someone adding information they had verified before including. The orbital path reference is precise. It is not a general reference to a vessel in their system. It identifies the specific pass, the altitude, the angle, the duration. Drev sat with that for a moment and let the implications of precise arrange themselves in the order they needed to be in. The contact team's survey pass had been conducted at a range the team had assessed as beyond detection capability for a Class 4 civilization. The assessment had been based on the civilization's observed technological profile. The observed technological profile had been compiled from surface observation during the survey window. He asked, how long was the surface observation window? She told him, 4 hours, the standard window for a preliminary Class 4 assessment. 4 hours to observe a civilization. 48 hours for that civilization to transmit a precise, referential, directional signal in response to the observation. He ran those two numbers against each other, and the result sat in his professional attention with a specific weight. He looked at the partial decode report. He looked at her working document. Then he asked her to get him everything the contact team had filed from the survey, not the compiled classification report, the raw field data, all of it. She pulled it. It took 12 minutes because the raw field data was filed in the contact team's primary archive rather than the accessible summary layer. And pulling raw data from the primary archive required an authorization level that Drev had and the overnight team did not normally use. He read the raw field data for 40 minutes. The overnight team gave him the space to read, which he noted as a mark in their favor. What the raw field data contained that the classification report had compressed into summary language was a series of observations that individually fit inside the Class 4 framework and collectively produced an unease that he recognized as the same unease he had felt when he reviewed Orev's recommendation 6 weeks earlier. The surface observation had been conducted over the temperate continent of the planet's northern hemisphere during the local daylight cycle. The contact team had documented settlements, agriculture, what appeared to be early-stage industrial activity, communication towers of a type consistent with local broadcast capability, and transportation infrastructure that the summary language described as pre-advanced. The raw data also contained, in the field notes of a junior observer named Merv who had been on her second contact assignment, a notation that had not made it into the summary. The notation read, "The settlement grid pattern in the northern continent is unusually regular. The regularity is not consistent with organic urban development. It is consistent with planned development at a scale that implies centralized coordination across a wider geographic area than the settlements themselves. This may be within normal parameters for a developing civilization. I am noting it because the regularity is more precise than I expected." Merv had flagged the notation for senior review. The senior review had not been included in the compiled report. Drev read the notation twice. He read it a third time with the specific attention of someone who was reading it differently on the third pass than on the first two, because on the first two passes he was reading the notation, and on the third he was reading the space between the notation and the compiled report where the notation should have been and was not. Then he pulled Merv's contact record and found that she had spent 4 years before her contact assignment work doing urban planning analysis for the authority's Settlement Development Division. She knew what planned regularity looked like. She had spent 4 years developing the vocabulary and the trained eye for it. She had applied both in the field, produced a specific and technically grounded observation, flagged it for senior review with the appropriate notation, and the compiled report had not included it. He sat with this for a moment that was longer than the facts required and shorter than the implications deserved. Then he put the notation next to the partial decode of the transmission and looked at both of them together. A settlement grid too regular for organic development, a transmission too precise for a Class 4 civilization. Both pieces of information had been available. One had been in the field notes and had not made the compiled report. The other had arrived 48 hours after the compiled report was filed. A civilization that had been classified as pre-interstellar with no communication capability beyond its own atmosphere had, 48 hours after the survey pass, transmitted a coherent directional signal aimed at the survey array's specific frequency. The transmission referenced the survey. It used an encoding system that was not in the 417 system reference library. He pulled analyst Sierra back to his station at 4:51. He told her, "I need you to work on the decode through the morning shift, not the partial, the full decode. I want to know what the transmission contains." She told him, "The full decode could take weeks given the novel encoding system." He told her, "I know, start it now. Flag any structural elements you can resolve as you find them. I want interim updates every 4 hours." She went to work. He wrote a memo to the contact authority director. It was brief, and it was precise, and it was the kind of memo that did not have a comfortable place to land, because it was describing a situation that the standard framework did not have a category for. The memo read, "The Class 4 civilization catalogued 48 hours ago has transom. It is a coherent directional signal to our monitoring array that references our survey pass with precision inconsistent with its classification. The encoding system is novel. We are working on the decode. I am recommending suspension of the standard post-classification observation protocol for this system, pending full decode and reassessment. I am also recommending that the contact authority senior review board convene on the supplementary note I filed with the original classification report, which I am aware was noted as lacking a specific basis. I believe the transmission provides the specific basis." He sent the memo. Then he did something he did not do often during overnight rotations, which was to make himself a second coffee and sit with it for a while before the next thing. The next thing was going to be significant in a direction he could not yet specify, and he had learned over 22 years in contact work that the moment before the next significant thing was worth sitting in if you had the time to sit in it, because once it arrived you were inside it, and the quality of the moment before it was gone. He sat with his coffee for 9 minutes. Then the second transmission arrived. He had been on his second coffee, and the morning shift had come in, and the overnight team had stayed as the memo had requested them to stay, and the main monitoring room had the specific quality of a space that had been running on adrenaline and professional discipline for several hours, and had found a sustainable level somewhere between the two. People were working. The decode effort on the first transmission was running. The extended observation protocol had been activated. There was a shape to the morning that suggested it was going to be a long day of careful analytical work. Then the second transmission arrived, and the shape of the morning changed. This one was not partial. This one resolved through the decoding protocol in a way that the first one had not, because it appeared to have been encoded differently from the first, not using a system in the reference library, not using the novel native system of the first transmission either. Using a system that was adjacent to several systems in the reference library, in ways that the protocol could navigate, close enough to known structures that the protocol could find its way through it the way you found your way through a space that was unfamiliar, but built on principles you recognized. The technical team lead pulled Drev from his coffee at 5:12. She crossed the monitoring room with the specific economy of motion of someone who had somewhere important to be, and the information she carried confirmed it. She had the 4-word report ready before she reached his station, and she delivered it with the quality of someone who had verified it 3 times before choosing to speak. She told him, "We can read this one." He put down the coffee. He went to her station. The second transmission was a message. It was in the standard Vorath diplomatic language structure, which meant it had been composed using the Vorath linguistic framework as a template. The Vorath linguistic framework was not a publicly distributed document. It was not something a Class 4 civilization was supposed to have access to. The message read, "We are aware of your classification system. We are aware of your classification of our world. We understand the framework produces the classification it produces when applied to the information your survey collected. The information your survey collected is accurate as far as it goes. We would like to suggest that 48 hours is not sufficient time to collect all of the relevant information. We are transmitting this in your own linguistic framework as a courtesy so that the point is not lost in translation. We would welcome a longer conversation." Drev read the message 3 times. Then he read the part about the Vorath linguistic framework. He read it again. He looked at analyst Sira, who was looking at him with the expression of someone who had also read it multiple times and had arrived at the same place. He asked, "How do they have the framework?" She told him, "That is the correct question." He asked, "What is the correct answer?" She looked at the message on her screen. A civilization that had been classified Class 4 48 hours ago was not supposed to be able to ask for a longer conversation in perfect Vorath diplomatic structure. A civilization that had been classified Class 4 48 hours ago was not supposed to know that the classification existed. She told him, "I think the correct answer is that the classification was wrong." He told her, "I know the classification was wrong. I wrote the supplementary note. What I am asking is how wrong." She did not answer immediately. She looked at the message. She looked at the first transmission's partial decode sitting open on the adjacent screen. She looked at the settlement regularity notation from Mayor V's field notes, which Drev had pulled up earlier and left visible. Then she told him, "I think we do not know yet how wrong it is, and I think that is the answer that matters right now. We do not know. The message is telling us that we do not know. It is doing so politely, in our own language." The memo he had sent to the Contact Authority Director at 4:51 received a response at 6:23. The director had been asleep when the memo arrived, and had been woken by the duty officer who had read the memo and made the correct call about whether to let the director sleep. The response was brief. It read, "Senior Review Board convened at 800, full overnight team to remain on shift. Extended observation protocol authorized. Please prepare a summary briefing for 800. Also please tell me how they have the linguistic framework." Drev wrote back, "I do not know yet. I will have a better answer by 800. He spent the time between 6:23 and 800 building the briefing. He pulled everything the contact team had filed. He pulled Merv's notation. He pulled the technical team's decode logs for both transmissions. He pulled the partial decode on the first transmission and set it next to the full decode on the second and looked at the two of them together for a long time. The first transmission, the partial one, had been in the novel encoding system. The second had been in a system adjacent to known Vorath structure, close enough that the protocol could navigate it. He had a theory about why the encoding had changed between the first and second transmission. It was the kind of theory that, if correct, had implications for the how wrong question that analyst Sira had declined to answer. His theory was that the first transmission had been in the civilization's own encoding system, the native one, which was why the protocol found it novel and could only partially decode it. And that between the first and second transmission, in the space of approximately 90 minutes, the civilization had received the protocol's partial decode attempt, analyzed what the attempt revealed about the Vorath decoding architecture, reverse engineered enough of the Vorath linguistic framework from the decode attempt structure to produce a functional working version of it, and used that version to compose a message that the Vorath decoding protocol could read without difficulty. In 90 minutes. He wrote this out carefully and then read it back twice before including it in the briefing, because it was the kind of sentence that required being certain you had written it the way you meant it before you handed it to a senior review board. It read the same both times. He included it. He noted in the briefing that the Vorath linguistic framework was not a publicly distributed document, and that the civilization's ability to reconstruct a functional version of it from a single partial decode attempt was, setting aside for the moment the question of what it implied about the civilization's classification itself, a significant data point about the capabilities the 4-hour surface observation window had not captured. He built this theory into the briefing in the careful language of a hypothesis rather than a conclusion, because it was a hypothesis, and he was a precise person. He also noted, in a parenthetical he almost removed but decided to keep, that the hypothesis was consistent with every piece of evidence available and inconsistent with none of it, which was more than most hypotheses could claim at this stage of an investigation. He noted the settlement regularity observation from Merv's field notes, and the fact that it had not been included in the compiled report, and the fact that Merv had 4 years of urban planning analysis background, and had specifically flagged the observation for senior review. He noted that the contact authority's senior review board should consider not only the question of reclassification, but the question of what had happened in the review process that had allowed the classification to proceed without addressing the flagged observation. He noted, in the final paragraph of the briefing, that the civilization had requested a longer conversation and had done so with courtesy and without any evident hostility, and that this was, in his 22 years of contact work, not the way civilizations that had been misclassified typically responded to the discovery of the misclassification. It was, he wrote, the way civilizations responded when they had been waiting for a longer conversation and were willing to begin it on whatever terms were available. The senior review board convened at 800. Drev presented the briefing. The board read the transmissions. The board read Merv's notation. The board asked questions that were good questions, the kind that came from people who understood the framework and were trying to understand how the framework had been applied in a way that produced this outcome. He answered the questions as precisely as he could. He did not know the answer to all of them. He was clear about which ones he did not know the answer to, because clarity about the limits of what you knew was the foundation of the kind of work that did not produce 48-hour updates to classifications filed 6 weeks ago. The board voted to suspend the current classification and open a full reassessment at 8:47. The vote was not contentious. The board had read the briefing and the transmissions and Merv's notation and the 90-minute linguistic framework reconstruction hypothesis, and the members of the board were experienced enough in contact work to understand what the evidence was saying even when what it was saying was something the standard framework did not have a prepared response for. The vote was unanimous, and it was quick, and the quickness was not impatience but clarity. Some things, when you had the full picture in front of you, were clear. At 9:03 Drev transmitted an acknowledgement to the planet's monitoring frequency, in Vorath diplomatic structure, confirming receipt of both transmissions and indicating that the contact authority was prepared to begin the longer conversation at the other party's convenience. He had chosen the phrase "the longer conversation" deliberately, taking it from the second transmission, using their language back at them the way they had used his language at him. It seemed correct. It seemed like the beginning of an exchange that was going to require both parties to pay attention to the specific words the other chose. The response arrived in 4 minutes. 4 minutes was, to Drev's knowledge, the fastest response time to a first contact acknowledgement in the contact authority's 112-year history. The previous record had been 22 minutes, set by a species that had been classified at a considerably higher level than Class 4. He noted the 4 minutes in his personal log with the same precision he had applied to the 90 minutes and the 48 hours, and the 4 hours of the original surface observation window, because the numbers were the shape of what had happened, and the shape was what you needed when you were trying to understand how something of this kind occurred. 4 hours to observe, 48 hours to respond, 90 minutes to reconstruct a linguistic framework, 4 minutes to confirm the conversation was open. He looked at those 4 numbers for a while. They told a story that the 14-page classification report had not told, through no fault of its own, because the information the numbers described had not been available when the report was written. The information had been available when the surface observation window closed. It had been available in the settlement regularity that Merv had noted and flagged. It had been in the field the whole time, patient, waiting for someone to look at the right part of it for long enough. He also noted, in a separate entry that he would file as a process observation rather than a personal log item, that the classification review process had failed to incorporate a field notation from an observer with directly relevant specialist background, and that this failure had not changed the outcome in any material way, because the planet had managed to correct the record on its own in 48 hours. But that it was the kind of process failure that warranted examination regardless of the outcome, because outcomes did not always resolve this cleanly. He put the basis in the log next to the supplementary note and the unanswered question about how wrong the classification had been, and he added a line at the end of the entry that was not standard log language, but that seemed, given the morning, to be the right way to close it. The line read, "They were waiting for us to be ready to listen. They appear to have been patient about it. I think we owe them a very thorough conversation." He read the line back. It was accurate. He filed it. Then he updated the classification in the registry. The field where Class 4 had been entered 48 hours ago now contained a different notation. Not a new class number, because the reassessment had not yet produced one, and he was not going to enter a number he did not have sufficient basis for, not again, not after this particular morning, not a placeholder. The field contained a single word that the contact authority's classification framework, reserved for situations where the standard classification system was not adequate to describe what had been found. It was a word the framework's designers had included knowing it would be used rarely, designed it to be used rarely, and had included anyway because they had understood that 112 years of contact work would eventually produce a situation that the framework was not adequate for, and that when that situation arrived, the most accurate thing the registry could contain was an honest acknowledgement of its own limits. The word was reassessing. It was, in Drev's professional opinion, the most accurate thing the registry had contained about this planet since the contact team first filed their survey. It was also the most accurate thing the registry had ever contained about itself.